Okay, well, thank you very much. I have a lot of slides to get through today, so I'll speak a little bit quickly. But if there's any questions, then you can ask them or reach out to me by email. I'll have my email at the end here. Today I'm going to be talking about designing and implementing decentralized longevity-focused clinical trials. All right, so I have a lot of things to cover. I don't think I'll go into detail with everything today because of sake of time. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at AgelessRx. Some of the hurdles that come with the field of longevity and increasing health span, and then share my experience when it comes to longevity-focused clinical trials. We've created these hallmarks of longevity-focused clinical trials to mirror the hallmarks of aging, and then talk a little bit about some of the approaches that we've been taking at AgelessRx. All right, so just real quick, AgelessRx, if you're on this conference today, then you know that aging is a pathological process that could. Hang on, let me take my. There we go. All right, aging is a pathological process that leads to frailty, functional decline, chronic disease, and it's becoming more and more clear that it's a process that can be targeted, slowed down, maybe eventually reversed. AgelessRx started out about 4 years ago building a telemedicine platform to help improve access to longevity, but also longevity therapy, but also to gather real-world data to understand the therapies better. So there are many kind of hurdles that come along with the field of longevity. The problem is there's a big scope when it comes to problem. By 2030, it's thought that 1 billion people across the world will be age 65 and older. They're calling it the silver tsunami. And one of the issues that we're having right now is even though we call it healthcare, it's actually sick care, meaning that conventional medical treatment waits until a disease is manifest enough in order to perform a treatment on it. And so you end up playing what's called a disease whack-a-mole, where you hit one disease on the head and another one just kind of pops up in its place. And the reason is, again, if anybody's listening, aging or the aging process underlies the entire or almost all chronic diseases. And so if you're only treating a single disease, well, the aging process is still ongoing, and you haven't really done much to address that. So that's why it's called whack-a-mole, because you hit one disease and the other one pops up shortly after. There's a lot of hurdles here. Here in the States, the FDA is still not considered aging a disease. That's the case in most of the world. I think there are some countries coming along to that. And then almost all clinical trials to date have focused on disease-specific outcomes. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And in order to clear the hurdles, we need to strategically design and implement robust clinical trials focusing on longevity. And the reason I'm presenting today is because even though AgelessRx is doing several clinical trials, it's going to take a big effort on a multimodal effort, and we're hoping this will encourage other organizations to also pursue this. Again, here's some statistics. I won't go too much into it, but you can see that back in the 1960s, lifespan was about 54, and so people spent maybe 30 some years in good health, 20 some years in moderate health, and the last maybe 5 to 7 years in poor health. Our lifespan has increased tremendously, almost 20 years between 1960 and 2019. However, that just means that we've kind of drawn out the amount of time that we spend in moderate and poor health. Excuse me. Targeting aging, targeting the process of aging is thought to help delay, prevent, or alleviate, or even maybe reverse many of the chronic diseases that the first world developed countries are suffering from. The 4 horsemen of death heart disease, diabetes, so cardiovascular disease, diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases such as dementia, and cancer are the big four. If you look at kind of the top killers in the United States and Europe and other parts of developed countries, you'll see that those four occupy usually the top 5, top 10, and they're the most common cause of death. And so intervening early will help prevent those, or at least that's the hypothesis. There are several trials that have either anticipated or have completed or are in various processes of various parts of processes. For example, rapamycin, there are a couple trials, AgelessRx is sponsoring the Pearl trial. There's another group out there doing the RAP Protect trial. Hopefully everybody's heard of the TAME trial, spearheaded by Nir Barzilai. You've got combinatorial trials such as the TRIM trial, and then more recently the TRIM-X trial, looking at a combination of metformin, growth hormone, and DHEA. And then you've got other trials that are looking for gerotherapeutics with rapamycin and something like a lifestyle intervention. This is, I believe, a group out of New Zealand who's doing this trial. And just for those who are not familiar with hallmarks of aging, although I think everybody is, I've only included the first 9 just for the sake of brevity. I know there's, I think, 4 more that were added recently. But just to kind of give you an idea, there's no shortage of existing interventions that are thought to target the hallmarks of aging. I've put several on here. Based on our understanding of these hallmarks and based on our understanding of these therapeutics. But the big question is, how does the theory of these interventions match the actual clinical aspects of it? And then, of course, what happens when you use them in combinations? How many of the hallmarks do you have to hit or do you have to modify in order to make a difference clinically? These are all kind of outstanding questions that we're trying to work at, through these clinical trials. I mean, whether it's real world data gathering or a formal clinical trial, gathering that data and disseminating that data for everybody to be benefiting from is very important. So we've kind of come up with the hallmarks of a robust longevity-focused clinical trial, again mirroring the hallmarks of aging. There are several here: partnerships, recruiting, screening, study cohort, what's the gerotherapeutic, or the biomarkers that we're looking at, endpoints, length of trial, cost funding, concerns, study design, data analysis, pragmatic goals, and partnerships. So I'll be talking briefly about these. Now, this is these are image to kind of highlight what the relationship between these design factors are. So once you kind of have a gerotherapeutic or an intervention in mind, then you have to start defining the goals of the strategy, defining the outcomes, endpoints, and then you got to kind of work on study design, study cohort, what biomarkers, how you're going to process the data, how long is the trial, and of course, cost is a big issue, and sometimes the cost kind of limits like the size of your cohort or the number of biomarkers you can look at. So let's focus a little bit about goals. So I kind of touched on this a little earlier. So I'm going to kind of differentiate between kind of a classical or a standard clinical trial. What's common. 99.9% of clinical trials out there are focused on disease, clinical biomarkers, let's say, such as LDL or calculated LDL. Sometimes they're based on disease outcomes. Obviously, you can't run a clinical trial forever, and so usually, you have to pick an outcome in terms of a time-based outcome. Typically, when you're treating a disease, you usually need to use a higher dose, a stronger intervention, and typically, again, you're looking at a disease population, so typically you're talking about elderly. When you're talking about longevity focused, you want to see how well you can prevent diseases. or at least study the hallmarks of aging through an intervention. So typically that means enrolling healthy volunteers, looking at biomarkers specific to aging. Some of those may mimic or reflect the hallmarks of aging. And then you have to look at outcomes. Ideally you want to continue on for as long as you can, because the idea is the longer somebody's on these gerotherapeutics, the better the outcomes. And because you're not necessarily you're treating a disease, you don't necessarily need to be as aggressive with dosing, so you can get away with a lower dosing or maybe an intermittent dosing. So lower dosing when it comes to metformin, for example, clinical trials look at 2,000 milligrams, maybe 2,500 milligrams for treating diabetes, whereas maybe preventing, if you start soon enough, you only may need 1,000 milligrams. Likewise with rapamycin, the consensus seems to be once a week dosing at around 6 milligrams per week, plus or minus a few milligrams. And then, of course, you want to, because you're casting a wider net, an undiseased health population, you can be more inclusive in terms of, demographics, geographics, things like that. So there are several goals that you could look at when you're designing a clinical trial. Is it health span enhancing? Are you treating? Are you looking at resilience versus looking at preventing a disease? I'll have my next slide talks a little bit about resilience. Is it exploratory or just validating a novel therapeutic or a novel drug or a novel repurposing of a drug? Are you demonstrating some kind of proof of concept, or are you looking at a safety? You have a promising therapeutic, and you just want to kind of do safety so you can continue on to further studies. I've had some descriptions here. And in terms of studies that that kind of fit these categories that we're familiar with at AgelessRx, for example, health span enhancing, we have a large cohort of patients using low-dose naltrexone, and many of them have completed a quality of life survey called the SF-36, and so we can derive from that information. I'll be presenting that information in a couple weeks at a conference, and we'll also be publishing that maybe several weeks after that. And then there are other trials that we're looking at in terms of like a patient-centered safety first. We launched the Pearl about 2 or 3 years ago. Hopefully we'll have that completed by the end of this year. But the goal, one of the main goals of the Pearl trial, which is our rapamycin trial, is to look for any kind of safety signals from the control versus treated. That's not the only goal, but that's kind of one of the major goals that we were looking for. So disease versus resilience, health span, the idea of extending health span, if you leave somebody alone, again, if going back to that first graph that I showed, usually they'll spend quite a bit of time, maybe 15, 20 years in either moderate to poor health. But the idea is that if you intervene soon enough or early enough, then you can stretch out their health span, their disease-free life as much as possible, and almost compress the morbidity down to the last several years. You see this commonly occur with the people who have genetic tendencies to be centenarians or supercentenarians. Or you can enhance the resilience. The idea of resilience is that the more robust a person's physiology is, the quicker they can bounce back from a stressor. And as somebody gets older, it becomes harder and harder and harder to bounce back from a stressor. And that's why typically somebody who's elderly and frail, sometimes all it takes is a pneumonia, for example, and that ends their life because they just couldn't handle their system was not robust enough to handle the stressor. And so the idea of targeting the hallmarks of aging with gerotherapeutics not only can help prevent chronic diseases and compress the morbidity a little bit more, but also make physiology more robust so that a person can bounce back from stressors more easily. So we at AgelessRx, we're a telemedicine platform, so we only do decentralized trials. Before the pandemic, we got a lot of pushback from the community about decentralized trials because it was still pretty new. But during the pandemic and now after, if we are after the pandemic, it's become a thing now. So we were ahead of the curve when it comes to decentralizing our clinical trial. And there were both pluses and minuses to doing so. It's definitely not a panacea. There are several drawbacks. For example, I mean, you're limited in terms of intervention. I mean, obviously you can't do, let's say, parabiosis or something like that through telemedicine, for example. Or if you want to do a skin biopsy or a muscle biopsy, you can't do that by telemedicine. That has to be something in brick and mortar in person. But but there are a lot of things you can do by telemedicine, and that comes down to a design study, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Selecting therapeutics. There's a lot of people on this conference today talking about various different interventions. So I'm going to be brief on this, but basically, like I mentioned before, there's no shortage, and these are kind of the lists that we currently know. 5-10 years from now, this list may grow considerably, and I expect it to, especially as new molecules come on the market. Also, as we start recognizing additional repurposed molecules, and even natural therapies as well, such as turmeric. Endpoints and outcomes. You either want to reflect lifespan or health span, and depending on the goal of your trial, you want to at least attempt to try to figure out a clinical primary endpoint rather than something that's more vague, such as methylation clock, for example, which is not really clinically validated yet, still very much experimental. Things like biomarkers and methylation clocks are typically best reserved for secondary endpoints. And at that point, when you're looking at secondary endpoints, it's usually a good idea to cast as wide a net as possible. Basically, as I'm in favor of looking at as many biomarkers or data points as the budget allows. We'll talk a little bit about how we can stretch that budget a little bit as well. Primary endpoints tend to be hard endpoints, such as death, for example, or survey markers if they're validated surveys. Disease versus non-diseased. There's also functional, such as like a 6-minute walk, or there are other, like I said, validated assessments such as the SF-36. Secondary endpoints that we talked about, various different biomarkers that have come on the market in recent years, and they're even exploratory. I mean, these are the biomarkers that we know of, but there are many exploratory biomarkers that are being looked at and coming up down the line. When you're looking at study design, of course, the gold standard is this randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. It's kind of been the gold standard for a while now. Example of that is our Pearl trial for rapamycin. We're trying to follow that gold standard, but there are a lot of limitations and drawback. We've discovered that it's not easy to do. There's lots of limitations to it, and it doesn't quite reflect the real world in many ways. So there are other study designs that are also useful. I know the RCT gets kind of the gold star, but it's often not a great idea, or not a good idea, to let perfect be what's that saying? Letting perfect be the stumbling block to good enough. You can glean a lot of data from prospective trials, from observational cohort trials, from cross-sectional, and of course case studies are very important when it comes to especially kind of the more exploratory studies. And here are some examples of things we've done at AgelessRx. Like we published a study on boosting glutathione levels using an antiphoresis patch, and like I said, Pearl is our RCT. We have a trial on long COVID or post-COVID using low-dose naltrexone and NAD. And we have a variety of different trials that we've either published, like our acarbose, or we're in the process of publishing, using these various different non-RCT modalities, focusing more on real-world data collection. There are several factors for decentralized focus design. Establishing a pipeline, continuing to have a strong connection with your participants. Make sure there's education and support. Especially if you're doing this remotely. You don't always have the the benefit of face-to-face, where you can make that rapport with a participant. So you need to work extra hard on the education and support of participants. Convenience, like I said, I mean, people have gotten used to doing things at home, or nearby. They don't like traveling as much anymore. I mean, a lot of patients are still willing to travel for various different tests and things like that. But like I said, you can kind of widen your net to a larger geographic area and potentially a larger demographic, if you make it more convenient. And then of course, safety. You want to design the study to be as safe as possible, but you also want to verify that it's safe using various different regular monitoring of blood panels if needed, depending on the intervention. Making sure you have a robust adverse event management system. And of course, data security is big when you're dealing with any collection. I mean, it doesn't, unless you're using like paper, but even paper can be stolen from an office. So there's no such thing as like, 100% security. But putting it out there on the cloud or on a computer, kind of adds to the security concern, just because, hackers have much easier access to large amounts of data that way. So you have to be extra careful. Another consideration is, using registries, taking patients who are on certain interventions and inquiring about their progress. AgelessRx was recently involved in a rapamycin registry looking at 333 patients who are on rapamycin for longevity. Very useful information. And typically, because these patients are already out there, they're already kind of self-experimenting. The cost is minimal. All you really have to do is have some kind of data collection and outreach program in order to pull it off. And of course, the registry in and of itself, may not necessarily guide clinical practice, but it can definitely provide valuable insights and guide further trials and data collection. Talk about study cohort recruitment screening. Again, larger trials tend to give you better data, and we need to look at as many diverse populations as possible. So that's kind of where, kind of strength in numbers and volumes, and it allows you to better find signal within the noise. This whole idea of, study power, things like that. Characteristics, I mean, you want to tailor the characteristics of your study cohort to the therapy. For example, with the Pearl trial, we specifically chose people over the age of 50 for a variety of different reasons. Part of it is, rapamycin's thought maybe not to be so healthy for people under a certain age, because it's still not clear what that age is, but it seems to be, if you're like under the age of 30, you should not touch rapamycin. It could be potentially detrimental, but if you're over the age of 40 or 50, then it's thought to be beneficial. And so that's why you need to kind of tailor your cohort to what you're looking for. Also, and I'll talk a little bit about this. Let me save this thought for another slide. And we coming back to diversity, just making sure that when you're recruiting, you're kind of recruiting for diversity if that's your goal. I mean, some people don't want diversity because they want to control as many variables as possible. So, but again, that's something that needs to be thought of ahead of time. Enrollment recruiting, it's always a challenge, it seems, for people to get enough participants and kind of drum up enough people for a clinical trial. We found it was surprisingly hard for some of our trials, but we had to jump through a lot of hoops to enroll people. But that's why kind of having a robust funnel, knowing, for example, how to run ads, how to ping people by email on your website, reaching out to various, knowing which forums and groups to reach out to, because the more money you spend on marketing, the less money you spend on the trial itself. So you have to be very smart with those. Screening, again, usually when you're doing a longevity trial, you want to kind of err on the side of being more inclusive, trying to get as broad population as possible. But again, that kind of can change. Now the other thing is, you want, depending on what intervention you're looking at, you want the population to be aged enough, meaning like not too elderly, so that you may not see any difference because maybe the aging has caused too much damage for any therapeutic to make a difference. But again, you don't want to enroll 20-year-olds, for example, in a longevity trial, because 20-year-olds, it's thought that they haven't started manifesting many signs of aging yet. And so if you're trying to target aging process in a 20-year-old, you're probably not going to see anything. They have a really high baseline to begin with. And again, I mean, you need a proper filter in place to separate the signal from noise, and that's kind of the exclusion criteria. Going back to health span trials, for example, I mean, if you're trying to prevent disease, then obviously you don't want to enroll people with that disease in there. Otherwise, it may make the trial too noisy. All right, let's talk a bit about biomarkers. There's no shortage of biomarkers, it seems. It seems like every day I'm reading about a new biomarker. But they're still, they're still pretty new, most of the biomarkers anyway. What we think of biomarkers in the clinical setting typically tends to be disease specific. For example, going back to picking on LDL again for a minute. I mean, LDL is, it's thought to be pretty specific for cardiovascular disease, for example. Hemoglobin A1C is pretty specific for diabetes, for example. But that's kind of where there's an opportunity here to look at biomarkers as a reflection of the aging biology and kind of reflection of the hallmarks of aging. Again, it's still pretty new territory, but it's not practical for somebody for a trial to look at hard outcomes, like, for example, death or prevention of disease, because that could take decades. And so that's why it's very important to include biomarkers, because biomarkers can be almost surrogates to these other outcomes. And then in terms of collection, you want to make sure you're collecting not too frequently to put a burden on patients or your budget, but frequently enough so that you're getting enough valuable data across the length of the trial. When you're looking at various different parameters to evaluate, there's a lot of things to take into account, such as the sensitivity of that parameter, what's the mechanistic insight you'll get from measuring something, and then of course accessibility. And then when it comes to decentralized biomarkers, I mean, surveys are the easiest thing, especially validated surveys. There are a lot of at-home collection kits. There are, mobile phlebotomy groups. There are, lab partners where you can contract with and send people to a local phlebotomy. And of course, just like any clinical trial out there, you can't do it alone. You need partnerships. And that biobanking is something that we're using more and more to help kind of stretch our budget. It helps almost like fail-proof our trials, meaning that we can collect samples up front, but not spend the money on analyzing them until the trial's over. And the other benefit of biobanking is that it allows you to store samples for when newer biomarkers come onto the market. Again, it seems like every day I'm reading about a biomarker, but if you don't take the time to biobank, then you'll have to repeat the trial every time you want to evaluate a new biomarker. So there's a lot of benefits to biobanking. There are downsides to it. It does take a lot of logistics, and cost is also a concern. Data analysis, you can do it through kind of a medical record system. There are other softwares more specifically for clinical trials. You can use things like Google Data Studios. And then duration. Again, it all depends on what what kind of outcomes you're looking for, what the therapeutic is. Sometimes you want an adaptive design where maybe you start, you kind of have like almost like checkpoints where you start at 6 months, see where you end up, and then you go to 12 months, and then you kind of stretch it out from there. That allow you kind of decide whether you want to continue on, but also give the flexibility of gathering more data. Cost. There's, again, a very it seems like everybody's budget is strapped. At AgelessRx, we were fortunate enough to crowdfund a lot of our funding for our main trial, the Pearl. Depending on your IRB, some IRBs will allow a kind of a patient funded trial within reason. Obviously, you have to be very careful there. And of course, you can always apply for grants. Those are very hard to get, as I'm sure a lot of you know. Ways to kind of stretch a budget is, having a flexible design. Sometimes you can make the design almost contingent, or some aspects of the design kind of contingent on your funding. That's kind of what we did at Pearl, where we biobank samples, and where we send those biobank samples will depend on how much budget we have and how generous our partners are when it comes to some of the discounts that they offer for us. And of course, partnerships. I mean, if you have a lab, for example, that's looking to vet out their biomarkers, and you happen to have a trial, sometimes that lab will be willing to subsidize for you. So it's always useful to ask around for partners. Again, it's not be something that should, longevity is not something that can be solved by one organization. Partnerships I've kind of already talked to about, so I'm going to kind of skip over this. Very important to get partnerships involved, partners and partnerships involved. All right, so I want to take a few minutes and kind of talk a little bit about our unique approach with our telemedicine platform. So we built, like I said, about four years ago, we launched the Longevity Telemedicine platform, and we've been kind of adding data gathering and data analysis. I call it kind of our engine of innovation to our system, ever since, and every day we're improving upon that. It allows, this kind of this N-of-1 experimentation, looking at longitudinal over time, looking at real world data, how does that translate? And we've gotten a lot of very, very informative insights, through our telemedicine platform. Again, this is almost like a registry, so to speak. But again, you have a hypothesis, you look at the data, you see whether the data kind of matches the hypothesis, and then you go from there in terms of like doing additional studies, follow-ups, maybe that kind of, you can spin off a trial to kind of explore some of the insights that you gleaned. All right, so that concludes my my presentation. Just a couple more slides here. If you want to learn about a research project, you can go to AgelessRx.com/research. We've been fortunate enough to make a lot of partners along the way, and we're always looking for more partnerships. Excuse me. So if anybody's interested, anybody is interested in kind of joining this coalition that we've put together, we'd be glad to discuss any partnerships. If you're a patient listening to this, prospective patient, you can get started by looking at our longevity assessment. And we have a longevity community as well. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for allowing me to present. You can email me, Dr. Zalzala at AgelessRx.com, or just the word doctor at AgelessRx.com will also go to me.